everyone. Pete and I are at the Gorton Center.
Hello.
We're about to walk into the quote-unquote transparency meeting.
Hi there.
Great. 2010, which we'll talk about a little bit, to ensure that our vote really doesn't need to be isn't really needed at all. So at any rate, many of you may have seen this slide that we were setting out before, but really the last 4 consecutive caucus elections that have been held, we've had some stickiness going on with the vote. Going back to 2022 in November, when all this started and sort of the creation of our organization, when Randy Tack didn't receive the affirming votes from the caucus, and under their bylaws, we thought we were going to see another candidate, but instead we were told that the vote was advisory, which is an important word that we'll be talking about tonight. And that advisory vote meant that they really don't have to accept it. They're saying things like it's not clear in the bylaws, which we also disagree with, what you're supposed to do in a vote. But it's also been a vote that's been on the books of our caucus since 1956. And I think that's an important thing to talk about, because in 1956, when we created the bylaws and created the structure around the caucus, which has been around a little longer, the caucus started in the mid-30s, but when the bylaws were adopted and the vote was put in, it was for transparency. It was for the ability for the voters to have a say, the people in this town to have a say, which really at that time they didn't. There was, in the 50s and the 40s, there was a lot of wealth and there were a lot of people working for the wealth. It's not the town that we have today. There wasn't a lot of affordable housing and things like that. So the creation came and the bylaws were put into play, and that vote was one of those bylaws, and has never ever been challenged, has never been thrown out, has never been not recognized until 2022. So then we had the ballot with a yes only on it in their next spring vote for their executive committee, and that had no vote on it at all. It was just a yes only, and they also changed it from the 7 candidates, yes or no, to a single slate. So another change that we didn't see or understand why that was put in. And then really more importantly, in April of 2023, in November of 2023, we voted on the Caucus Preservation Act, which was an amendment to the bylaws to remove our right to vote altogether, and being told that too few people show up to that vote, so it should just be more of it should be more of a vote of less of confidence, if you will. And then we all know what just happened last week. We repeated 2022, where the vote was 132 to 125 against the entire slate again of candidates, where we got Chris Bennis's response that said they kind of looked around, they thought maybe they could find someone, they couldn't, and they just thought it was best again to move forward and ignore our vote. So we in our organization, Lake Forest Transparency, obviously we're inundated with a whole lot of emails, articles, texts coming in, and we thought it would be important to bring Ed Mullen in to talk a little bit about what that really means to us. Caucus has not been without its share of news articles, specifically on the vote. We have seen a plethora of articles written in the Tribune, on the Patch, in the Sunday Tribune that came out, that all sort of indicate the same thing, that what's going on with our vote seems to be a little crazy. Chris Bennis said in his email that he sent to us that lacking clear direction in the bylaws on how to proceed after the spring meeting, the caucus committee decided these committee members would be best to lead the caucus in 24 and 25 to sustain its mission. We don't believe that that is the best thing. And if you read the bylaws, Sheila Henretta spoke on this last year, who's an attorney who specializes in corporate law and bylaws, and said, no, if the process is that there's a majority vote and that the action should be taken by the members, the general members of the caucus, for them to be approved to move forward. And that did not take place now in 2 of the elections. Section 5.01 at the bottom, the responsibilities of the executive committee shall be to coordinate the election of its candidates recommended by the caucus committee and approved by the caucus. These are important words, guys, and these are things that are written, and they're written for a reason and were put in. They're not vague and ambiguous. They're written like bylaws are written. Joe Reedy was recently quoted, and if you want to read the whole quote, but basically it said that the 43 residents, which deliberated going back to the public for another vote, but decided that was not a viable option. Nobody wanted to go down this way, but these were the cards we were dealt. So the cards that they were dealt was to throw our vote away, is what we're seeing. And so if the bylaws can be ignored for expediency, then the argument that Joe Reedy is the only person who can serve as a president goes out the window. The caucus can pick someone else and ignore that same bylaw requirement also. I mean, this is important. There is no excuse for not holding another vote or holding another election, which is what we think they should have done. Presented a new ballot and given us another opportunity to vote on the new ballot. Chris Bennis has been saying quite a lot recently, and other members of the caucus, about the Lake Forest survey that went out that 6,000 families responded to. And in that survey, on the first page, it says 98% of the people who live in Lake Forest are very satisfied and happy living here. And then they drew a direct line from that statement to "you're welcome" from the caucus. And the fact is that in that exact same survey, which is just frightening to me, the exact same survey, and it's hard to read, but the top of the circled letter says, confidence in Lake Forest city government, 24% to 40%. City council acting in the long-term best interest, 24 and 36%. That's the exact same survey that they're claiming 98% of the people were overwhelmingly satisfied with the caucus. It just seems like a diversion, in my opinion. So today, when we bring up Ed Mullen, there's 3 questions we really want to bring to the table. 1, are Lake Forest Caucus bylaws binding? 2, are the bylaws regarding elections binding? And 3, does the Lake Forest Caucus have a contract with its general membership to obey those bylaws? So with that, I'd like to introduce Ed Mullen, and then we'll, at one point, then we'll start fielding questions as well. Thank you very much.
Hello. I'm not used to talking in auditoriums like this. It doesn't look like court. So my name is Ed Mullen. I'm an attorney. I do a lot of election law, and I work with a lot of political organizations, whether they be political action committees or political party committees. I represent the Lake County State's Attorney, the Lake County Treasurer, the Lake County Sheriff, the Lake County Clerk, majority of the Lake County Board, and Lake County Democrats. I do the legal advice on their bylaws and their organizational meetings. So I've been doing this for a long time, and this is one of the more unusual situations that I have run into, despite all of those different organizations that I've worked with. So just to start off, this presentation is not legal advice. This is for informational purposes only, and I am not your lawyer, and you are not my clients, and I have to say that. So, informational. In talking to the folks that I've talked to so far, the first confusion arises out of what exactly is the Lake Forest Caucus. And when you go to vote for candidates that are Lake Forest Caucus candidates, is that the same as the Lake Forest Caucus that is the organization, the Lake Forest Caucus that is the PAC? And I think some of that confusion leads into the bylaws and all of the other issues that have been raised. So the Lake Forest Caucus, as the organization, as the website, as a political action committee, is, according to its bylaws and according to what I've been able to locate in all of the state databases, is organized as a political action committee under the Illinois Election Code with the State Board of Elections. That means it is a legal entity and it is registered with the State Board of Elections as the Lake Forest Caucus Political Action Committee. Political action committees are an umbrella term under the election code, and there are a lot of different types of political action committees. There are candidate committees. So if Mary Edley Allen is running for office and she has a political action committee, that is called a candidate committee. But we're not talking about candidate committees. There are ballot initiative committees. When we had the fair tax referendum, the folks who were in support of it and the folks against it had ballot initiative committees. The political action committee is an umbrella term for a lot of different types of committees. One of those types of committees is a political party committee. You can only start a political party committee if there is some authority for you to be a political party in the Illinois Election Code. So one of the ways to do that is to be what we call an established political party or a new political party. So originally, when the Lake Forest Caucus set up its political action committee, it represented that it was a political party committee. What that meant was that there was a political party called the Lake Forest Caucus, and this political action committee was the political action committee of the people who were legally entitled to set up a political party committee. So they had to have some authority by being elected or appointed through the Illinois Election Code. So up until 2010, the Lake Forest Caucus was a political party committee, and people could both be members of the Lake Forest Caucus Political Action Committee, but also run for office as the Lake Forest Caucus. But if you look at your more recent ballots, people are not running for office under the Lake Forest Caucus political party. They are running under a political party that is what we call a new political party. And every year they create a new political party that has the year of the election cycle in it. So if you looked at your ballot for the last cycle, it said 2022-2023 Lake Forest Caucus. And that full name was the name of the political party. So the political party was not just the Lake Forest Caucus. And the reason they do that is because if you are a new political party, you file your petitions and there's one election, and you file a slate of candidates, and those candidates are elected in April, and they go up against anyone else who is from an established party, an independent, or another new political party. If you ran as a Lake Forest Caucus member, just Lake Forest Caucus without the year, and you got over 5% of the vote, the next cycle that came up, you would then go from being a new political party to being an established political party. When you become an established political party, that means that you have a primary. That means that anyone can file petitions to run as a member of the Lake Forest Caucus and have a primary, so that it wouldn't be the group of people on the Lake Forest Caucus Executive Committee deciding who was going to be voted for at the April election. It would be anyone who went out and got petition signatures, filed as a member of the Lake Forest Caucus in the primary, and then there would be a primary election among those people in the Lake Forest Caucus, and then there would be a general election where whoever is selected as the representative of the Lake Forest Caucus at the primary would then be competing with anyone, if there were Democrats, if there were Republicans, if there were Libertarians, if there were other new political parties, if there were independents, all be competing against them in April. So if the Lake Forest Caucus had remained a political party committee and a political party, it would have become an established political party, and the control that the Lake Forest Caucus had over who could represent the Lake Forest Caucus would be gone because there would be a primary election. So in 2010 to 2011, the Lake Forest Caucus changed its registration with the State Board of Elections from a political party committee to a political action committee. And that's important for a couple of reasons. One, because it completely divorces the political action committee from the party that's on the ballot. So it used to be that the committee and the slate were of the same political party. But now you have just a general political action committee called the Lake Forest Caucus, and then you have a completely separate entity every cycle that's created that's a new political party to put officers on the ballot. And so by creating a new political party every cycle, that requires a slate of candidates to be proposed, and it does not allow for a primary. So it allows the people who are in charge of the Lake Forest Caucus, the executive committee, to select who's going to be on the ballot and make sure that there's no primary and no openness in who is officially representing what is called the Lake Forest Caucus on the ballot. So when you have a party committee, they're legal representatives of the party committee. So for instance, you have the Lake County Democrats. The Lake County Democrats is made up, or Lake County Republicans, are made up of the elected precinct committee people in the state. And the elected precinct committee people have the ability to make decisions as a body on behalf of the political party. And so those decisions that they make are binding on what the political committee that's registered with the State Board of Elections is required to do. So for instance, if you have a county convention and the Republicans elect Mark Shaw to be their Republican county chair, then because of his election as the county chair, he has the authority over the political committee that is registered as the county political committee, because the law combines the party apparatus with the political committee. What that also means is that the people who are the precinct committee people have the authority to make decisions as a body on behalf of the party and the committee. So they can create bylaws, they can vote on things that are binding because the precinct committee people are elected and the county party is a body that is recognized in the election code. And so if the Lake County Democrats or Republicans pass bylaws through their elected precinct committee people, then those are generally enforceable bylaws because they're voted on by people who have legal authority from the election code. What's different with the Political Action Committee is that the Illinois Election Code with a Political Action Committee, which is what the Lake Forest Caucus has been since 2011, recognizes only two legal representatives of a Political Action Committee. It recognizes the chair and the treasurer. So the State Board of Elections, which the political committees are filed with, only recognize the chair and the treasurer. They do not recognize the rest of the executive committee. They do not recognize the members. As far as the Board of Elections is concerned, that you file your paperwork with, you file your disclosures with, they enforce all the campaign finance rules, they only recognize those two people as the legal representatives of the campaign committee. So because Lake Forest Caucus is recognized by the State Board of Elections as a campaign committee, the State Board of Elections only recognizes the chair and the treasurer of the committee as having any legal authority over the committee. So if you were to go to the State Board of Elections and say, wait a minute, this person should be the chair and this person should be the treasurer because we had this vote under the bylaws, the State Board of Elections is most likely going to say, well, that's up to the chair and the treasurer because those are the only people who we recognize under the law as the representatives of the committee. So if the chair and the treasurer are telling us one thing, then that's what we have to follow, not what the general vote is. So that doesn't mean the bylaws are not enforceable. What it means is it's a question of whether the bylaws create a contract. So there is a body of law in Illinois that says if you have an unincorporated association and that unincorporated association has bylaws, those bylaws are considered a contract between the people who are members of the unincorporated association, and that is enforceable. So just because the State Board of Elections might not recognize it, a court using contract principles is likely to recognize that the bylaws are enforceable to the committee, to the members. But that is something that would, require legal action to enforce. So when we're talking very specifically about the most recent election, the question is whether the bylaws are advisory or whether they're enforceable, and that raises a lot of different issues. But if the committee is saying that they're advisory, I think the question in my mind is the section that they're referring to about how the election proceeds advisory, or are the whole set of bylaws advisory? And is this a whole house of cards that they're holding up with smoke and mirrors and saying, well, we've got this great set of bylaws and we're representing all the people of the city of Lake Forest and we're doing all these things with candidates and with appointments and we're doing a great job, but the notion that this is coming from the people of Lake Forest is just smoke and mirrors because the bylaws are not something that we're actually going to follow. And that's where they get their legitimacy from. They get their legitimacy from the notion that the decisions are being made by the members, and the members are the people who are voters in the city of Lake Forest. So as far as the section in the bylaws that is relevant is concerned here, section 4.03 of the bylaws says that candidates for office or position shall be recommended annually for office by the current executive committee from among the members in good standing of the caucus committee and shall be presented for election at the spring meeting. So they're being recommended by the caucus committee, executive committee, and they're standing for election at the spring meeting. So if the vote is disregarded, it seems to me that that is violating the plain language of what the bylaws require, which is that the executive committee do the recommendation and that the membership votes. What is complicated about this is that there's no procedure for what happens if the membership doesn't vote for who's presented. There's nothing that requires there to be a slate election. So the idea that just because there's only one person who might be qualified for president means that you have to pass the entire slate of everyone who's running doesn't seem to be something that's required by the bylaws, nor does it seem to fall within the spirit of the bylaws if the people of the city of Lake Forest who were at the meeting and voted did not elect those people to be on the executive committee. So what I would be asking when they're saying advisory is, are you saying that this election under section 4.03 is advisory? Or are you saying that the entire bylaws are advisory and that you only have to follow them when they tell you to do what you want them to do? And is this just smoke and mirrors to say that the people have the power to make these decisions, when in fact it's the executive committee that is doing whatever they want and ignoring the bylaws. So that is what I was asked to talk about. And I will take any questions. I am going to move though, because I can't see you. Does that microphone move?
Yeah.
I'm going to come up front here, if that's okay, because I can't, that's not doing well for me.
My name is David Rose. I live in the Fourth Ward, and I think what struck me from your comments is there's something much more sinister going on here, and it started in 2010, 2011, because the way the caucus has operated is such that they keep very tight, close control over who runs, and the worst thing that could ever happen is having an open primary where you have a transparent vote, the community is engaged, people come forward to serve, and the community gets to have a vetting of candidates. The way the committee is operating each and every year by redeclaring itself and keeping a tight hold on its little group of members with its little group of selected nominees who go to the general and then people rubber stamp it. It suggests to me that, I think the real Lake Forest Caucus needs to stand up. What we have is an illegitimate caucus. It's illegitimate because of their behavior the last 4 votes of late. But really, I think if you go back to 2010, where you used to be able to have, and I don't know if this is true, but were people able to have were there multiple nominations? Were there people who were looking at 2 or 3 maybe alderman choices from the 4th ward, the 2nd ward, the 1st ward? So I think that the idea that I have for a caucus is it brings together the community, it engenders rich and vibrant conversation on issues and topics. It brings people forward who want to serve and who get to share what they want to do for the city. And what we don't have is that inclusion. And so I would say there's many things that come to mind, like, boy, I would love to file a suit in court, get an injunction from a judge, have the judge offer a custodian executive committee to redraft the bylaws. And you could do that, or you could simply say, we're going to develop the real Lake Forest Caucus. It's going to be a political party. It's going to operate in opposition to the Lake Forest Caucus, and it is going to have nominees come forward. It is going to raise money in the community, and it's going to represent the real Lake Forest in a representative way, not as a closed group that excludes and ignores votes. So there's a number of ways you can go if we don't have money for an attorney, but I love the idea of challenging their bylaw process, but I think that could be going down a rat hole, and I think the real light at the end of the tunnel is making the caucus operate the way it's supposed to operate, and not being afraid of being a party, the one party in the city that's going to operate on behalf of all of us, and do what we think the caucus is supposed to do. Do you see an issue going that route and just challenging their standing in the community as the Lake Forest Caucus? Because the one thing that gives me the most ire about this is they're not representing me, and I'm part of Lake Forest, so they're illegitimate on their face. They're not the Lake Forest Caucus, and I'd like to take that name off their letterhead. Until they behave that way, and if they're not going to behave that way, which they've demonstrated, then we should just form our own group called the real Lake Forest Caucus. What do you think of that?
Well, I think you raise a lot of issues. The first thing I'd say is, the caucus procedure works in other communities when the caucus procedure is open. So it's not necessarily the caucus procedure that's always at issue, because if you have a caucus and the caucus comes in and they select candidates at the front end, then the rubber stamping in the back end is okay. But here you have rubber stamping at the front end and the back end, and so there's no real no real input from the broader community. So, you know, the question is whether you want to fight on a legal front, which, you know, is uncertain, it's expensive, and, you know, then you wind up all fighting each other, and that may not be the way that you necessarily want to go about it. The other is through the public, because, you know, if the public thinks that they're not getting involved because they see the caucus as doing the job for them, and then they realize that the caucus is closed and not listening to what the community says, then, you know, they lose their legitimacy. But if people keep voting for who the caucus puts up, then, you know, per se, they have the legitimacy that continues. So I think you need to educate people on, you know, exactly what they're doing, and you have to put up candidates that are going to run against them. You know, one of the things that you could do is try to create the Lake Forest Caucus as an established party. You can't go tell the Lake Forest Caucus they can't put their letterhead of Lake Forest Caucus. You can't do that, no. But what you can do is try to create a Lake Forest Caucus party by running people under that without the year and making it an established political party, and then you have an open system for people to just circulate petitions and get on the ballot. So there's legal, there's political, and there's public, and you can do all three of those, or you can do any combination of those. But you know, I think what I'd like to hear is do they think their bylaws are enforceable? Or I think that would be a really important answer.
A question we have posed since 2022, and have been given no response to.
Hey Ed, my name is Philip, and I'm in Ward 2. I'm curious to talk a little bit about what you mentioned about contracts, and the fact that since 2010, the caucus has operated under the, you know, I guess the assumption that, hey, these votes that they're hosting, that we're all going to, and they're getting positive results. 15 years down the road, there's a result that they don't agree with and they just ignore it. Is the past experience, I guess, impactful of like a binding contract that like there is past experience that says we are listening to what the community says, and in this scenario they're going against their own contract.
Yeah, you know, I don't want to get too much into the legal theories, but you know, you've got a contract theory that says you have an agreement. You know, a meeting of the minds, everyone has agreed that this is how we're going to be governed, and so it is a contract. And then you have quasi-contract theories. But one of those is a theory called promissory estoppel. And one of the elements of promissory estoppel is reliance. So the fact that the community has relied, and candidates have relied, and donors have relied on the notion that all of this is enforceable and that the vote of the people is going to be followed, then that will have an impact on the quasi-contractual theory for the bylaws being enforceable.
Susan Watson.
Can you hear me? Yeah, the thing, a couple of things. One is, I'm Jim Borg. I've been in this city here for over half a century. One aspect that concerns me is the open-ended prospect of costs relating to litigation. The city has got the opportunity to use our tax dollars to fight us forever. And when one remembers that they spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on a small thing like trying to stop Burger King, and then they blew another $1 million after being advised not to do it, to stop the gentleman that had the McDonald's over on 43, you get an idea of the kind of money that the city is willing to expend for trivia versus something which would challenge their legitimacy. So then I wonder whether there's something in the state constitution rather than filing litigation from us, where you could appeal with a plebiscite, say to the city, to the governor or the attorney general of the state of Illinois, and say, hey, we're not being treated fairly from the standpoint of equitability and representation, et cetera, and that they, maybe the attorney general of the state of Illinois, could act to restore some semblance of democratic process.
That's something I'd have to think about, but off the top of my head, the Attorney General is tasked with enforcing the law. What you find when you practice law is there's two bodies of law. One is equity, the other is statutory. I'll leave it at that. The Attorney General is really not equipped to deal with the equity side. They are tasked and organized to deal with statutory enforcement and enforcing, someone not following, like, the Freedom of Information Act. They have a law. They have elements for when it's not followed and how to enforce it. When you're talking about equity, they don't really have guidelines, they really don't have procedures, and that's not really where the Attorney General goes. And I don't see anything in what I've looked at that they violated any particular statute. It's that, what they're doing is not really what they say they're doing. And that's more of a court issue than an Attorney General issue. But it's something to think about.
Well, I guess I have two questions. The first is the city has outsourced, my name's Bob, I'm in the first ward. The city has outsourced the HR, for lack of a better purpose, of filling the commissions to the caucus. If you go to the city's website and you want to volunteer for one of the commissions, they will send you to the caucus. There have been allegations in the past that the caucus has maybe not followed what would be sort of equal employment rules in trying to fill those positions. Is the city running a risk that by outsourcing its HR function to the caucus and the caucus basically going rogue, that the city could then get itself in trouble?
Yeah, the caucus doesn't insulate the city from liability for violating any type of employment statute. So if the city has an obligation to, and I don't know what particular equal opportunity, I mean, you could have county laws, you could have city laws that I'm not aware of, but whatever those laws that are applicable to the city are, the city needs to follow those laws, and outsourcing the appointments to the Lake Forest Caucus isn't going to insulate them from any liability for not following them. So yes, they would be responsible for anything that was done wrong because the recommendations were in violation of employment laws.
So things I've heard are both gender and age-based.
Sorry?
The issues that I've heard about the caucus decisions are around both gender and age. And so both of those would be in violation of, of the law, I assume.
If you're not having someone appointed to a commission because of their age or their gender, that would be an issue, yes.
Okay, and that's been my understanding of what the caucus has done in some cases. My second question is much shorter and much easier. Every citizen in Lake Forest is supposed to be a member of the caucus, or every voter in Lake Forest. Since I don't want to be party to an organization that is basically following Putin's rules of order, how do I get out of becoming a member of the caucus?
I don't know.
Yeah, and to his previous question, though, the caucus vets candidates and then recommends them for appointment, and then the mayor appoints them to city council that confirms them. So I don't know if I think it's more the vetting process that you were talking about that seems to have gone very dark. There are people that fill out the forms and they never get a phone call back. There are people that say they want to, there's people sitting in this room who have filled out the forms and never gotten a phone call back, or both serving on the caucus or serving as an appointment from the caucus. So I don't know if that helps, but the caucus doesn't pick the appointments. The caucus that's the candidates. That
Right, so whoever in the city is ultimately making the appointment, if they're only appointing, people who are younger and male, then they're being discriminatory. But that is an interesting question about how you exclude yourself from membership. They're saying that they're not putting any responsibility on you. They're just saying that anyone who is, I think it's a registered voter in the city, is a member and able to vote. That's an interesting question. I haven't thought about that. I will think about that, though.
So, if I wanted to start the Nazi Party of Lake Forest and say that every, voting member, every registered voter in Lake Forest is a member of the Nazi Party of Lake Forest, that's the same thing.
That's a good question.
Okay. Liam?
Stumped me.
Me too.
I won't be joining you. My name's Liam Connell. I'm a resident of Lake Forest, and I have no idea which board. I'd like 2 points. On the contractual point, when I went to the elections for the voting mechanism, there was no mention of advisory. It was pretty clear that it was meant to be a selection process. So, apart from them not following their bylaws, and I'm not an attorney, but I assume that they had an obligation, contractual obligation to me when I participated in that election, that there was a contract. I had a ballot that didn't say advisory. I put a mark on that, and I assume, after taking the time, that was the deal. So the second point I'm going to make is the only way we're really going to get clear answers is that we have to send a legal letter from an attorney. I'm speaking of somebody who sued a lot of people, and the only way to get people to take you seriously is with an path. And I believe I would have standing as a member. So if nobody else sends a lawyer's letter, I'm going to send one. So, but I'm hoping that we do it.
Just the first point, is there a separate contractual issue with having voters?
I don't think it's I don't think you created a separate contract. I think it was part. I don't think you created a separate contract. I think it was just part of the overall contract. I'd have to think about that more. But if you were there pursuant to the bylaws and the provision of the bylaws that said the executive committee recommend and you elect. So to me, that's the contract, and what you were doing was part of that contract.
Yes, sir.
Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Lee Eddy. I'm from the great Second Ward. In Europe,
I'm from the 49th Ward. Is there anyone here from the 49th Ward?
We stopped at 4.
So in your opinion, regarding the most recent vote, what is the most effective and efficient way to cause the caucus executive committee to recognize the vote as a legitimate election?
I don't think there's one single way. I think one way
What do you
is
feel is the best?
Well, I think the quickest way is for public sentiment to turn against them and for them to lose the legitimacy that they have within the community. You know, because a lawsuit isn't gonna, lawsuits are not fun and they're not quick. And so that's an issue. And then the other thing is the political. You've got an election coming up. You know, you're gonna have petitions due in the fall and you're gonna have an election in the spring, and that could create a lot of change. So, you know, if you start with the public sentiment and you roll that into a political activism for the fall and the spring, then you don't have the people who are going to listen to the Lake Forest Caucus in office, and you know they're not appointing people, they're not recommending people, and they lose the power. But you know that's less than a year from now. That's not a lot of time. A lot shorter than a litigation.
Ray Bushman. I'm originally from the 4th Ward, been in Alderman in the 4th Ward, and now in the 3rd Ward. First, a point of clarification. Our caucus operates in 2 different ways. One is for the elected officials, and that's what's been the subject here, and the right of the citizens to be able to vote for who they're recommending. I'd like to cover that later, but the other question was asked, and it was an HR function and a reference to employment law. What we have with the boards and commissions, these are all voluntary positions. They're viewed as a voluntary position, not as an employment status with the city. And you know, how they're selected and whether they, you know, operate under the Civil Rights Act is a whole separate question. But you know, I'd like to recognize that they're all volunteers for boards and commissions, paid nothing and handled through the caucus. The issue we have before us now is the elected side of the equation, particularly mayor and aldermen, and the fact that the caucus was created under the concept of the old caucus concept, that it's the people we want to hear from, the people who are going to control where we go. Now, you gave a definition of a PAC, and from the state standpoint, it's whatever the president and the treasurer says. That's not what we've been told. That's not what we've understood. It's always been, this is every one of us as a citizen, as a voting citizen, are members. We want to hear from the members. And if you read the bylaws and you pointed out the provision that to me clearly said they have a recommending part of the role of who's going to be slated, and we, the citizens, have an election role to play. That is to be elected, both the candidates that are going to be on the caucus and the candidates that are going to be on the ballot. I never saw advisory in there, anything other than it's a recommendation by the committee and a vote by the membership. And it really bore out after that first vote for Randy Tack, where you know they weren't sure how to handle it. Their solution was, the caucus committee solution was to come back with a misnomer calling the Preservation Act really was to take away the vote. They clearly came back to the citizens and asked us to approve a bylaw amendment, taking out the right to vote for their candidates and the right to vote even for the officers, the very issue here. And they needed a 2/3 vote under the bylaws. They did not even get a majority vote. So you have, of course, a conduct there that their own admission was if they're not going to honor the vote, they have to change the bylaw. And they did not succeed in that. And that gets to the point of, you know, the fact that we've been sold, what, a bill of goods, that the members, the citizens of Lake Forest have a say in the caucus. And that, let me bring to the next point. You talk about the tax, and unfortunately we've heard a little bit more than we ever knew about tax on the federal side, and money going for legal fees and things like that, and the super PACs and this. Do we have a PAC structure like we have here that they create a bylaw? And they say, this is how we're going to operate our PAC. We're going to have these officers, we're going to have these committees, we're going to have broken down by 4 wards, 9 people in each, and we're going to have votes by the citizens. I take from what you said earlier that that's not recognized as part of a PAC, or is it?
It's complicated. So if you are a party committee, there is a stronger argument that the bylaws are enforceable because the people voting on the bylaws are people who have their position as a result of something in the election code, whether they've been elected precinct committee person or ward committee person or something like that. So they have voting power that comes to them from the election code, and so that's considered more than, you know, a non-political party. So creating a political party is one way. The other thing is the definition of a political action committee says it is a person, a trust, a corporation, an organization, an association, or a group of people that do X, Y, Z. So one of the things that you can do is you can create a nonprofit organization, so a 501c4. And if you create a not-for-profit organization under the state of Illinois Not-for-Profit Corporation Act, then you have a whole section of that code that relates to the authority of bylaws and the requirement of bylaws. And so you create bylaws for the organization, and that organization is what sets up the PAC, and so there's a stronger relationship between the bylaws and the political action committee. Pardon? No, I could not find one on the Illinois Secretary. I looked on the Illinois Secretary of State website and the IRS website to see if they had created any other type of organization, and I could not find one. And typically they go back pretty far. But the caucus, if you look at their statement of organization, it says they were created in the 1930s. They don't have a specific date. So it's been around a long time, but it's only been since 2011 that it's been a political action committee and not a political party committee. Right, so the new political party is under the election code, and the political action committee is under the campaign finance law. So, well, they're both in the election code, but one is about running for office, the other is about campaign finance. So under the running for office part of the election code, it says you can run as a established party, a new party, an independent, nonpartisan. Can't think of anything. So a new party drafts a petition that says, to the Lake County Clerk, we the undersigned wish to create a new political party for these offices, and these are our candidates. And the petition looks like your petition for any other office, but it's got the slate of the candidates for the new political party. And then there's an additional document that goes with it that says, we are the officers of the new political party. And so it says, this is the president, this is the chair, this is the secretary, and that's signed, and that goes with the petition. So you create an entity that is a new political party running a particular slate for that election. But what happens is, it's only a new political party for one election. So either they get 5%, at which point in the next election they're an established political party, and they have to follow the same rules as like the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, or they start over with a new political party, again, that has a different name. And so that's what the caucus has been doing, is that they've been creating the 2021 caucus, the 2023 caucus. So at every cycle, it's a totally new political party with a new political name. So the question was, how does the new political party spring out of the Political Action Committee caucus? And the answer is there's no legal requirement that it does. It's just because that's what they've decided to do. They don't have to do that anyone else could create a new political party. There's no legal relationship between those two things.
Hi, my name is Gene Cartwright. I've lived in Lake Forest for over 30 years. Most of the time in Ward 1, but now in Ward 4. Just one thing on nomenclature to make sure I have it right. I haven't been active at all in the community. I've been really community for 5 days a week for the last 15 years or so. On nomenclature, the Lake Forest Caucus is all the voting citizens, and the Lake Forest Caucus Committee is, I just want to make sure I have the nomenclature right, because a lot of times we talk about the Lake Forest Caucus as being the caucus committee, I think.
Okay, so the Lake Forest Caucus, as a legal entity, is a political action committee registered with the State Board of Elections. The political action committee has a set of bylaws that says they're organized as a political action committee and that they have an executive committee and a membership, right? So when you say Lake Forest Caucus, what I understand that as a lawyer to be is the political action committee that is registered with the State Board of Elections.
That seems to say something a little different, right?
So I guess, yeah. So what he's saying is more in how it's the exact structure of the nomenclature of our town is we have the executive committee. That's the 7 or the 11, if you will, because each ward chair is also a member of the executive committee, and that's the president, the vice president, treasurer, and secretary, fundraiser, etc. That's the ballot we just voted on and they turned down. The caucus committee are the 43, the 9 from each ward. So they're kind of the internal part. And the general caucus membership is everyone in this room that can vote.
Right, that is what I thought. And so I just would encourage us to try to be say what we mean. Because sometimes I was getting confused when people say caucus, when I think they really meant caucus.
It's why we made this slide.
Yeah,
You're not alone in this town.
Right,
And we have another slide that I'd be happy to tell you that tells you what all their responsibilities are as well.
Thank you. The second thing is, again, I haven't been active, so I don't really know the answer to this. If you were to vote, instead of for a slate, if you were to vote for individual people, would you have to have, suppose that you wanted to elect 7 people, wouldn't you have to have more than 7 people on that ballot?
This is an affirmation vote for candidates that they put up. This is not this. That's why the term vote gets used a lot as opposed to election. So when the caucus puts up their executive committee, they're just putting one candidate up each, and then we affirm yes or no whether we want them to be. This last time, 132 no, 125 yes. And then in the fall, they will also put their slate of candidates up to run in the general election. Every other year it's the mayor, and then every year it's 4 aldermen and 4 school board members. And they do not. They don't have primaries. They don't. Now they'll have a first, second, and third choice, as they did before, and they'll announce who they are. We always thought that that first, second, and third choice meant that if the affirmation vote didn't take place, and they lost the affirmation vote, then they would go back and say, okay, we're going to take candidate number 2 that we vetted, and we're going to put them up. But in that case, I'm sorry to call out your name, Prue. In that case, Prue Beidler was number 2 on the ballot, and that is not what they wanted. So they went back and said, no, we're going to stay with candidate number 1 again and disregard the vote.
Okay, and that still leaves open the issue of what happens if the affirmation vote isn't positive for the...
That is the crux of
all
all
of
this.
I only have one last thing, and that is, we always talk about the vote, and are there any requirements for the number of people who vote in order to create a quorum or anything like that?
Nothing in the bylaws reflects that, only that there's a vote and the majority of the vote has to vote yes.
Okay, and lastly, I was just elected to the caucus, so I'm, very happy to learn more and be part of it. So.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for your service.
While we're on the subject of the caucus committee,
committee and its function. I just want to say that I am a former member of the caucus committee. Its function is to find people, to interview people, to select them for boards and commissions, and then also to put them up for recommendation for elective office. The theory behind that is in part because it is very time consuming and it's very expensive to run your own election. So if you get the committee to select you, and the caucus, general caucus membership to affirm your candidacy, then you get extra help. Not everybody has 100 and some people who can sign a petition for them and then help get the word out about their qualities. You know, there's some people that just wouldn't want to be in the public eye as much as they would need to be. So that's the good that the committee can do, is that they can draw those people out. That's the idea behind 9 people coming from each ward and then an executive committee. The crux of the matter is that we all believe that we have a say. And that's why we're all here tonight. And at what point do our bylaws become superfluous if no one challenges them? And if they're ignored and no one challenges them?
They become superfluous as soon as no one challenges them when they're not followed. You know, because if you don't challenge when they're violated, then they're going to continue to be violated.
Good evening, all. My name is Alfred Tomaselli. I'm an 18-year resident of Lake Forest. Whether or not it makes any difference, I live in the first ward. One of the things that I recognize is that biological entities survive with blood, and non-biological entities survive with cash. And so one of the things that would be helpful to disarm the caucus committee would be to figure out a way to stop the flow of funds to support the actions that they have taken upon themselves. That's an idea, that's not a recommendation. What I'd also like clarification on is in the Illinois compiled statutes that deal with established political parties, what the law says it cannot do is it cannot dictate what happens within the party itself. It can't, the election laws don't dictate what happens within the committee and how it functions. And I suppose the argument can be made by members of the caucus committee that they are immune to the election laws when they have a vote, because the vote is in and of itself not an election. Now, I'm not being a devil's advocate here and saying that what they've done is okay. I'm adamantly opposed to their disregard to the will of the caucus general membership. Is there any, the alternative would be to create a second party. I wouldn't use the words Lake Forest Caucus in the alternative party. I would think of something a little bit more creative and a little bit more substantive and a little less local, so that there would be an entity of substance that would have, that would show the respect of the law that the current executive committee and caucus committee have chosen not to respect. That's all I can say.
Thank you. One thing I did want to point out is, just so we all heard it, because I know a lot of things have been said, the caucus committee, or the caucus itself, does not receive any tax dollars from Lake Forest. They are a fundraised organization. They take donations. That is how they get their money. They have some good benefactors, though, when lawsuits do come up. The city government, though, is our general but city government has the ability to use tax dollars for lawsuits. I just wanted to make sure that that was clear. Questions?
Yeah, so, can you hear me? Glenn Arnold, Third Ward. I just had a quick question on just statistics. Historically, the Lake Forest has been around since, what, 1860 or something like that, and the caucus has been around since the 30s. If you have statistics on the percentage of the residents each year going back as far as you can find in terms of level of participation in these votes, in these events for election, and that's my first question. I don't expect an answer right now tonight because that's a lot of statistics that you're going to look up. But the second point is, in my way of thinking, you can always lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. And if the community's been around for this long, dealing with the caucus, and by inference, you know, if they were that disgruntled, we'd have 600 people here, or 1,000. And I just don't see that happening. And so it ends up just inferring to me that the folks that are on either side of the continuum, if you will, that are really the most vocal, are actually just the smallest portion of the population that are unhappy or they want change. And so I have to look back at all the history of the Lake Forest area and to look at it from the standpoint of if voter participation is pretty low. I mean, I was looking at the caucus vote here 2 weeks ago or whatever. I think yes or no for the caucus, support for it or not. I think there were 350 people that showed up to vote. You have 19,000 people in the city, and so my first question is, let's go back to history and look at what the participation rate is on that, and then look at it from the standpoint of if you're really disgruntled, that participation rate should start being elevated or not. If people are okay with everything, you'd find probably a low participation rate, because if they were really unhappy, they'd be voting in force.
Well, for your first question, and it's a good question, and it usually revolves around tensions in the town. I can go back to the 80s and the 90s. I'm not that old, but when the Heritage Party started up, and we had 800, 900, 1,000 people showing up at the caucus elections for candidates. They've had years where they've had 30 people show up at the caucus election. So that's a fair question. But then in general, equating it to the general public, our general election for mayor usually doesn't yield more than 3,000 voters that come out in total for that election. And in this last election, almost 6,000 people, a little over 6,000 people came out and voted because there was more contention going on. And also the CPA vote that happened last November, their numbers say 1,600 people showed up to that vote. So it's really what's triggering, and right now, I think most of the people in this room believe that what's triggering this right now is there's some changes happening in our town very quickly that are being decided by our city council, that the city council is appointed by our caucus, that when we're asking for changes from our caucus, we're being told no. When we're asking for positions on the caucus, we're not getting phone calls back to even be vetted. That the processes themselves have changed so much over the years. 20 years ago, if you wanted to be on the caucus, maybe 25 years ago, if you wanted to be on the caucus, when you filled out that form, your name was on the ballot. Sometimes you'd have 13 names show up on that ballot in your home to vote by mail for. The caucus took it upon themselves to say, no, we're going to tell you who the 3 are you can pick from at this point, or the 4 to select down. So there's a lot of little doors that have been closing over a period of time with our caucus right now, that I don't blame every member of the caucus. In fact, thank you for, he left. No, you're there. Thank you for joining the caucus. I have a lot of friends on the caucus. In fact, I don't think most of the caucus even knows what we're talking about in the room tonight. But if you're going to talk about the vote, 3 of the last 4 votes, the caucus lost, and it's their vote. Why aren't they getting more people out to the vote? Why aren't they getting more interest in what's happening in the vote? And in this last vote, it was 125 voters, but you had the caucus vote for themselves there. So I don't know if every caucus member was there, but you're talking 30, 40 votes out of the gate that weren't there. So it's usually driven by whatever the subject matter is. And ironically, the biggest thing on most of, from our city government that we've been finding is what's happening with city development right now. And if you go back 30 years ago, when the Heritage Party started up, this was when Conway Farms and the Ponds and Settlers Square and the business district down the Tollway were all happening within the same 6-year period. And there was a great deal of rampant development happened that was also going to change the complexion of the population of our town. Hence, we were having caucus meetings, or not caucus meetings, city council meetings that we're having hundreds of people attend because there was that. I think that's where we are at right now. I think there's not enough people informed at this point. We're trying to inform more people, but I do believe that's where we're at right now.
I think it should also be noted that the caucus has not, the executive committee has not advertised the elections in any way. They allotted 1 hour from 7 to 8 on one Tuesday night for people to vote. And so I think that, you know, it's hard to get more than a few hundred people to show up within a 60-minute window. Right? And I don't think that people are knowing what's happening. For example, I got the invitation to the Ward 1 meeting today that was for yesterday. So, coincidence?
Timing.
I don't know, right?
So I just to be clear, because the caucus has been having the spring vote for a long time, and it's always been a 1 hour window. And in their defense, they've always said it's a 1 hour window, because usually 30 to 40 people show up to it. When we asked Chris Bennis this on our podcast, Chris said, if there are people in that line until 10 o'clock, we'll stay there to let them through. And he also released, for the people that may have received it, a statement of the same. I just wanted to make sure that was clear, because the caucus did recognize that and did, you know, before the vote, recommend that, or let us know that that would be taking place.
So, just a quick answer to a question I think you hit on as well. When, I think it was Hunt said that only 3% of the electorate voted down TAC, and that really doesn't count because it's such a small number. I went back and looked at uncontested mayoral elections, and generally well less than 20% of the electorate vote for the mayor. And therefore, you know, I don't know what the magic line is between 3% and less than 20%, but, you know, it seemed disingenuous to claim that just because 3% of the people voted, it wasn't binding.
We're in a rough spot right now. We really are in this town. And the fact is that, as I was stating earlier to this gentleman, is I've lived in this town my whole life too, since I've been 2 years old. And I'm not involved. I've been accused, why didn't you run for caucus? Why didn't you have school board? Why didn't you run for mayor? All these things. And because I just trusted it was working. And I wasn't showing up to all the votes. I just trusted it was working. The lights were going up at Market Square at Christmas time. The beach ramps and the boat ramps were being put in on time. We had enough police cars on the road. Everything seemed to be fine. Over the last 6 years, though, we've seen the most radical change in our central business district when it comes to development. We've seen almost 17 new condominiums being built, and no one on this stage, I can't speak for Ed, is against development. It's just the processes by which these were taking place and the rapidness by which they were taking place. And the fact that we didn't have a comprehensive land use study before we were doing these things that are starting to trigger more people. There's a lot of different groups that are around. We have our Historic Foundation. We have Lock the Box, which was very adamant about a building being built behind the library. You have our organization that wants to hold our caucus in check for our vote. You know, and this is where it starts. It's a groundswell. It starts small, and then it gets bigger if people get involved and are concerned. Are there any other questions for Ed? Are there any other legal questions?
I don't know if this is a legal question, and it might be a silly question, but how does someone not get approved
one of the things that we've been talking about in our organization is we've made it clear from day one, we are not out to burn down the caucus. That was never our intent. We are feeling more and more pushed into that position right now, but we never were. But there should be an addressing of our procedures and our bylaws. There should be a community-wide presentation or meeting or series of meetings to get input on that. But I absolutely agree with you. And I use the term little doors because, you know, one day we have a ballot with 7 yes, no, then we just have a ballot of a slate of yes only. One day we had the ability, if you were going to be wanted to be on the caucus, your name would be on the ballot. And then the ballot would go out and then the people in the neighborhood would vote for it. If the name wasn't on the ballot, then you don't get to pick. That's been taken away. The vetting procedures and processes for a lot of our commissions and our plans in this town have sort of gone by the wayside, and we're finding a lot more like-mindedness within those commissions where we didn't have those voices that we've had in the past standing up and saying, no, don't take my park away, or no, you know, we don't want this type of a business in our town, or whatever it is. And you're not always successful as government. You can lobby all you want. I mean, Block the Box, they lost their lawsuit. They put up a good fight, but they lost their lawsuit. So I think if there's going to be anything healthy to happen to this town, we have to have reform from within our caucus, and it has to happen from within that caucus. Or, and I've said this before and Ed said it, or if they are not going to change, then we're going to have to consider running in general elections independent candidates for the different slates and slots that are out there, which is a lot more expensive and a lot more divisive to a town. But if there's no other recourse or no other option, and that's where you find yourself, then that may be a conversation that we're having sooner than later. We'll see.
Again, everybody, I'm sorry, questions, legal questions for our attorney first. Is that okay? There's lots of general questions going on.
Hi, I'm Melanie Rummel. I'm an ED tax alderman in Ward 2. I have 2 questions. The first one is your opinion about the breach of contract related to what they're stating in their bylaws. Would that apply also to the vote that happened to slate the mayoral and aldermanic candidates last fall? Do you think that they breached their contract when they didn't acknowledge that Randy Tack lost the vote for the mayoral slot?
I don't have an opinion on that because I didn't read that section of the bylaws as closely as I read the one relating to the last vote. I think the question of whether the contract is valid or not is the same analysis. The question of whether what they did breach the contract, I can't answer that right now because I don't have the historical knowledge of what happened, and I wasn't asked that, so I didn't read that section of the. But if they ask, I will look at that closer and get an opinion on that.
Well, because I think you'd have 2 counts. I think they really breached at least twice. First, last fall, in the November vote to slate the candidates for the city council, and then again in this most recent vote that they chose to go. So I think, let's not forget that November vote. I think that's equally important. And then my second question for you is, so you win a contract case, what sort of remedy would you request?
Well, I would request what's called specific performance, which is that the contract be enforced and that the results of the election be binding, and that the caucus committee that was proposed, that they have to go back and do another vote.
All right. If you go back to November, what does that do? Well,
I don't think you can do that at this point because of the time that's passed.
Well,
yeah.
But
I think if you, I mean, you don't really have money damages or anything like that. So it's you want enforcement of the contract, and here the enforcement of the contract would be
to say that the vote against the slate was valid and that those people are not members of the caucus committee or executive committee, and that, you know, the bylaws are frankly silent on what happens then. So that's,
Right,
that's an interesting question.
So would the court get involved in telling the caucus what they're supposed to do next? I mean, I just think we have to kind of.
Well, you would ask in the remedy for a process that is consistent with the bylaws to be in place, yes.
And you're saying that you don't think we could go back to the November election?
Well, the November election was for, who was elected in the November election?
The mayor and several aldermen.
Right, but when, they're already elected officials now.
They are elected officials.
Right, so we can't go back and take them off the ballot now that they've been elected.
Right, okay.
Amy?
I'd like to just put a point on that, because if we were to file, I'm Amy Francetic in Ward 3, I served on the caucus in the early 2000s in my ward, and I guess my point is if we were to file a lawsuit enforcing the contract, can we then make it very specific that we reject those candidates for the executive committee and we want new candidates? So they can't just put up the same slate again and then ask for another vote, because I don't think that would be productive. I don't think that we would want to spend all the money on the lawsuit if they were just to put forward the same slate and then just ask people to come vote again. That seems sort of pointless. So how could you make the lawsuit have a little bit more accountability?
Right, so that would just be in the remedy that you asked for, and you would, we would have to think, first of all, I always view lawsuits as a last resort. You want as much as possible to resolve this by, public pressure, political pressure, trying to get the bylaws enforced, trying to get the bylaws amended, etc. If you do go to court and enforce the contract, you're limited to enforcing what is in the bylaws. You can't sort of create an extra contractual remedy that's not in the bylaws to say that you want to enforce the bylaws. So what you have to do has to be very specific to the language of the bylaws. So the first thing is that the election results would be binding, and so that the folks that were set up are not elected. The problem then is that there's not a lot of guidance, but it seems like it's just been a rubber stamp in the past, that has never been an issue what happens if they're not approved. So you have to come up with something that is consistent with the framework of the bylaws to ask.
So could we ask that the bylaws be amended so that they include a remedy for a no vote that requires different candidates?
Well, I don't think that you would necessarily frame it as amending the bylaws. You would try to come up with procedures that are you'd read the whole bylaws as a whole and try to come up with a remedy that is consistent with the structure of, and when we have a statute and there's a hole in the statute, you look at the statute as a whole and you try to figure out how best to fill that hole based on the structure of the statute. And you would try to do something similar here. You wouldn't say we want to amend it or change it, but say it's silent on this, but because it says all these other things about how things are supposed to be done, this is the way that is most reasonable in light of all the other language in the contract. So yeah, you would be very specific about what you want.
Why would there not be a directors and officers suit against the directors and officers for violating the contract?
Can you say that again? I'm sorry.
Why would there not be a suit against the directors and officers of this entity for violating the contract, knowingly violating the contract?
So the suit would though be just a breach of contract. I mean, what else would you sue them for? I mean, if you wanna sue them, you know, you wanna sue them for fraud, you know, they are intentionally going out and misrepresenting what these bylaws say, then you would have to prove that they had an intent, that what they did caused damages, and you know, that they defrauded the public. So that, you know, if that's something that you're interested in doing, there's law on that. I don't know enough about their intent and, you know, who's running things and what's being done to suggest that that's a good option or not. But that's possibly. It's like a law school exam. I mean,
you need a bylaw expert.
I mean, could you say that they, you know, the caucus committee has a fiduciary duty to the membership? Possibly. You know, then you get into the business judgment rule, and you know, we're going down a couple rabbit holes here.
You still have the time and expense.
Yes.
Yeah, you can sue anybody. You can sue for anything.
Right, but I mean, fraud is harder to prove. You have to plead it with specificity, and you have a higher standard of proof to make a fraud claim. But you have a broader remedy as well. So, you know, again, you know, I always like, you know, this is a community. You all live together, and have to continue to live together. So, you know, do you really want, and this is your decision, not my decision, but do you really want someone to come in guns blazing and accusing people of fraud and breach of fiduciary duty, that are your neighbors and friends? That's your call. But, you know, that's a much harsher lawsuit than saying that you think that they have not followed the rules of the caucus, and you need to just be cognizant of that.
Supervisor, Ward 1. I've had a little experience lately with the caucus, as some of you know. I think it comes down to trust. I mean, I don't think most of us here are looking for damages. Like John, I didn't grow up here. I married somebody who did. I've been here for almost half a century now. I trusted the caucus for years, and I was on the cemetery commission. I was an alderman. You know, I didn't always agree with absolutely everything that happened, but I knew that by and large, the people who were on the caucus committee were incredibly earnest, well-meaning people who worked incredibly hard. I mean, to do that HR function, they interviewed so many people. Now, you know, a couple of times I've had an opportunity to question people in the caucus about various things. And for example, they don't get bias training. They're HR people. They're doing HR work. I know they're volunteers, but they deserve to be trained. They deserve to be trained on interviewing skills and on HR. As far as I can tell, and I have a pretty serious background in not-for-profits, they don't do any kind of reflective examination of their effectiveness. So they don't look at what is their mission, and are they accomplishing that? I don't have any sense, and I've asked this now multiple times, do they stand back? Do they ever bring in anybody, professionals, to take a look at their effectiveness? It seems like kind of a closed loop, and the direction seems to be going more that way rather than less. So for those of us who for years thought, boy, this town is pretty well run. Now, let's be clear, the caucus is a piece of that, but only a tiny piece. I mean, those of us who are aldermen, and I think most of you understand, there are a whole lot of pieces that make Lake Forest well run, including the kinds of people who are attracted to live here and get engaged and keep their property up so our property values are good and that kind of thing, care about schools, all sorts of things. I think it comes down to, in the end, trust. For years, the caucus got used to being trusted. They sort of took that for granted, and if you didn't always trust them, you were an outlier. The fact that I ever had the umbrage to ask questions made me, you know, that was something that I was very much encouraged never to do again, and I was offended by that. Did that stop me contributing to the caucus? It did not, because I understand that organizations kind of ebb and flow, and these were people mostly of goodwill. But if you ask me now, is that still my assessment of the caucus? I would not say that. Now, I think probably mostly the people who get on the caucus are people of goodwill, but I don't really know that anymore. I don't, after my own personal experience, I cannot stand up and say, this organization, which has served us for so long, is the right organization to continue in the job it's had. And they don't expect us to criticize it. And I will say to someone who said, well, shouldn't there be 6,000 people here? I think this meeting was organized yesterday. So I'm pretty darn impressed by how many people, and I know some of you I invited to come, but most of you I didn't, so somebody else did. You found out about this through Lake Forest Caucus or somehow. And good for you for coming and caring enough about this community to say, what can we do? And nobody here said anything outrageous. Nobody said blow up anything. People said, what can we do? And I think what people want is an organization that serves the community well and is trustworthy.
You should run for mayor.
If there are no other questions, I want to thank everybody for coming out, especially, ladies and gentlemen, and everyone, especially.
Thank you.
If you have any other questions right now, just so the room could leave. If there's anyone else who wants to stay afterwards for a little bit, we'll stay up here. But other than that, thank you very much.
Thank you, John. All right. So, Joe.